Hey, tonight we're going to talk about an empire that technically never ended. Not in the sense that its ideas survived, though they did. Not in the sense that its culture persisted, though it absolutely did. I mean in the very literal sense that the Byzantine Empire considered itself the Roman Empire, called itself the Roman Empire, insisted it was the Roman Empire, right up until the moment in 1453 when the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II rode through the gates of Constantinople, and the last emperor died somewhere in the fighting, and nobody could find the body. 1,123 years after the traditional date of Rome's fall in the West, still calling itself Rome. There's something I find enormously satisfying about that level of institutional stubbornness.
The Byzantines, and they never called themselves that, by the way. That name was invented by later historians who found it tidier than writing Eastern Roman Empire every time. Were one of the most extraordinary civilizations in human history, and one of the least appreciated. They preserved Roman law, Roman administrative structures, and Greek intellectual culture through the entirety of what the West calls the Dark Ages.
They held back wave after wave of invaders. Persians, Avars, Arabs, Vikings, Bulgarians, Normans, Crusaders, and eventually Turks. With a combination of diplomacy so sophisticated, it constitutes its own academic discipline, military technology that their enemies couldn't understand, and a bureaucratic system so elaborately complicated that historians are still untangling it. They also had court ceremonies that took entire days to perform, an empress who ruled alone and had her own son blinded so he couldn't challenge her, a general who became emperor by having everyone who disagreed with him executed, and a diplomatic manual that advised sending potential enemies gifts of such extraordinary quality that they would be too distracted admiring the gifts to remember they were supposed to be fighting. This is going to be a good night. Before we begin, like the video if history like this is what you needed tonight. Subscribe so you never run out of nights like this one. And drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. There is something I genuinely love about knowing who is out there in the dark with me. Now, dim the lights, let the room settle around you. Get as comfortable as your body is asking you to get. This is History in Sleep, and tonight, Constantinople is waiting. It has been waiting more or less for 1,500 years. A few more minutes won't trouble it at all. In 476 CE, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer walked into the palace in Ravenna, informed the teenage emperor Romulus Augustulus that his services were no longer required, and sent the imperial regalia to the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople with a polite note explaining that the West didn't need its own emperor anymore. One emperor for the whole empire was perfectly sufficient. This is the date historians use for the fall of the Western Roman Empire, 476 CE. It appears in textbooks with the comfortable finality that history occasionally provides, the kind of date that students write on exams and teachers circle with a red pen if missing. The emperor in Constantinople, Zeno, received this note. He read it.
He considered it. He sent back a diplomatic response that was, by Byzantine standards, absolutely masterful. He acknowledged the letter, he gave Odoacer a title, he made it all seem perfectly orderly and arranged, as though this had been the plan all along. And then he continued ruling what he considered to be the Roman Empire, because as far as Constantinople was concerned, the Roman Empire had not fallen. The Western territories had experienced some administrative difficulties. Rome itself was dealing with a temporary management situation, but the empire was fine. The empire was right here.
The emperor was sitting on his throne in Constantinople, and everything was perfectly in order. This attitude, the absolute,
unshakable, institutionally embedded conviction that they were Rome, that Rome had not fallen, that Rome could not fall because it was currently operating from this very palace, defined the Byzantine Empire for the entirety of its existence. It was not nostalgia. It was not fiction. It was a sincere constitutional position, maintained through law, ceremony, and the daily administrative reality of governing what was genuinely one of the most sophisticated states in the medieval world. And it was, in most practical senses, correct. The Eastern Roman Empire that became what we call Byzantine was, at the time of the Western Empire's administrative difficulties, the wealthier, more urbanized, more strategically defensible, and better governed half of the Roman whole. Constantinople, the city Constantine the Great had established in 330 CE as a second Rome, sat on a narrow peninsula between the Golden Horn Inlet and the Sea of Marmara, at the exact point where Europe met Asia, where the Black Sea trade routes met the Mediterranean, where every overland route between east and west was funneled through a single, controllable, magnificently defensible bottleneck. The walls of Constantinople were the greatest defensive structure in the ancient and medieval world. Not Hadrian's Wall, not the Great Wall of China. The Theodosian walls of Constantinople, built in the early 5th century and running for approximately 6 kilometers across the landward approach to the city, were a system of such sophistication that they were not successfully breached for over 1,000 years. An outer wall, an inner wall higher than the outer wall, a moat in front of the outer wall, towers at regular intervals with overlapping fields of fire, a military road running between the walls for rapid troop movement. Attila the Hun, the man who had swept across Europe, reducing cities to ash with an efficiency that historians still find impressive, looked at the walls of Constantinople and decided he had other priorities. The Avars besieged them and failed. The Arab armies of the early Islamic expansion reached Constantinople and could not take it. The Vikings, who were at the same time sacking Paris and raiding the coasts of England and Ireland, found Constantinople impregnable and, displaying a pragmatism that does credit to their reputation, decided to become its elite palace guard instead. The Varangian Guard, the famous Viking mercenary force that protected Byzantine emperors, was essentially a group of people who had arrived intending to conquer and were persuaded by the architecture to take a job offer instead. Justinian I, who reigned from 527 to 565 CE, nearly reconquered the West. His general, Belisarius, one of the most gifted military commanders in the ancient world, a man who consistently won battles against numerically superior forces, who reconquered North Africa and most of Italy with an army that historians describe as surprisingly small for such an ambitious project, retook Carthage, retook Rome itself, retook Sicily and Sardinia. For a moment in the mid-6th century, the Roman Empire genuinely looked like it might be putting itself back together. It didn't, ultimately. Italy was expensive and difficult and kept requiring military attention. The Persians pressed on the eastern frontier. The plague of Justinian, one of the first great bubonic plague pandemics, which swept the Mediterranean world in the 540s and kept returning for the next 2 centuries, killed enormous numbers of people and disrupted the agricultural and economic base that military campaigns depended on. But Justinian left behind something more lasting than territory. The Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, the systematic codification of Roman law that his legal scholars produced under his direction, became the foundation of legal systems across Europe. When European kingdoms began developing their own legal traditions in the 12th and 13th centuries, they did not invent from scratch. They looked east to the Byzantine codification of Roman law and built on it.
The legal DNA of most Western countries today runs through Justinian's Byzantine Law Commission of the 530s. The empire that followed Justinian faced challenges that would have destroyed most states. Continuous warfare on multiple frontiers simultaneously. The rise of Islam in the 7th century, which swept through the empire's richest eastern and African provinces in the space of a decade.
Plague that returned periodically for 2 centuries. Repeated dynastic crises in which emperors were deposed, blinded, mutilated, or assassinated with what historians of
The period note with fairly remarkable frequency. And through all of it, the administrative machine of the empire kept running. Tax records were kept, laws were enforced. The city of Constantinople continued to function as the largest and most sophisticated urban center in the Western world.
While the rest of Europe navigated the early medieval period with largely rural economies and fragmented political structures, Constantinople maintained running water, sophisticated drainage systems, street lighting in some areas, hospitals, university-level education, and a currency that was accepted as the international standard from England to China for most of the early medieval period. The Byzantine gold solidus was the dollar of the medieval world, minted to consistent specifications of weight and purity for over 7 centuries. It was the currency that everyone trusted. Arab merchants used it. Indian traders accepted it.
Found along the Silk Road, in Scandinavian hordes, in West African trade networks. The gold coin of a state that insisted it was still Rome, accepted without question as the most reliable money available by people across the entire connected world. The empire that wouldn't admit it had fallen kept functioning, because in the ways that actually mattered to the people living in it, it hadn't. The administrative genius of the Byzantine state was not something that sprang into existence fully formed. It was inherited from Rome, refined over centuries, and adapted to a world that the original Roman administrators could not have predicted. The Roman Empire had always been, at its core, an administrative achievement. The creation of a system capable of governing diverse peoples across enormous distances without modern communication technology. The Byzantine East inherited this tradition and, crucially, found ways to sustain it through the successive crises that would have destroyed less institutionally resilient states. The theme system, developed in the 7th century in response to the Arab invasions, was one of the key administrative districts called themes, each governed by a strategos, a military commander who also held civil authority. This reorganization served the immediate purpose of making the defense of the reduced empire more efficient, concentrating authority in the hands of people who could respond immediately to military threats.
But it also created a new class of provincial administrators who were deeply invested in the defense and maintenance of their particular territory, because their authority and income depended on its survival. The themes also served as a recruitment base. Byzantine soldiers were, in many cases, given land within the themes in exchange for military service, a system that created a class of soldier farmers with a direct material stake in defending the territory they farmed. This was not the Roman legionary system, in which professional soldiers served for terms of years before retirement.
It was something closer to a militia system of considerable effectiveness, producing soldiers who fought with the particular determination of people defending their own land. Constantinople itself was the administrative and economic heart of everything. The city's population, at its Byzantine peak, has been estimated at somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people, making it, for most of the early medieval period, easily the largest city in the Christian world, and competitive with the largest cities in the Islamic world. This concentration of population created economies of scale that were simply not available elsewhere in medieval Europe. specialized craftsmen.
Sophisticated financial instruments, banking families who operated across the Mediterranean, a silk industry that was one of the empire's most important economic assets, maintained by imperial monopoly and producing goods that were exported across the known world as luxury items of the highest prestige. The Byzantine silk industry was itself built on a form of industrial espionage. Silkworms were native to China, and the Chinese had maintained their monopoly on silk production with considerable determination for centuries. In the 6th century, during the reign of Justinian, 2 monks, the sources say they were Nestorian Christian monks, which places them conveniently outside the main Byzantine ecclesiastical hierarchy, a useful distance given what they were about to do, smuggled silkworm eggs out of China, concealed in hollow walking staves, and brought them to Constantinople. The silk industry that resulted was not as large or as ancient as the Chinese original, but it produced goods of sufficient quality and quantity to be one of the empire's primary export commodities for the rest of its existence.
The economic system that the Byzantine Empire maintained through its middle centuries was the most sophisticated in the Christian world, and arguably in the world more broadly. Byzantine merchants operated across a commercial network stretching from England, where Byzantine coins have been found in significant numbers, through the Mediterranean, across the Black Sea, along the Silk Road, and into the Indian Ocean trading world. The empire's position at the intersection of the great trade routes of the ancient world was not merely geographic good fortune. It was actively managed through the maintenance of the currency, through the regulation of trade, through the granting and withdrawing of commercial privileges to foreign traders as a tool of diplomacy. The Venetians, who would eventually contribute to the empire's downfall, first acquired their crucial trading privileges in Constantinople through a combination of military assistance and diplomacy in the late 11th century. The Byzantine court granted Venetian merchants the right to trade in Byzantine ports with reduced customs duties, a privilege worth an enormous amount of money to a trading city-state, and one that Venice leveraged into commercial dominance over the eastern Mediterranean trade routes. The relationship was economically important to both parties, and politically fraught from the beginning, a combination that tends, historically, to end badly for at least one of the parties involved. It ended badly for Constantinople in 1204. But that is a story for a later hour of the night. What matters for now is the picture of what the empire actually was at its height. Not merely a military and political structure, but an economic engine of extraordinary sophistication, sustaining a population larger than any other Christian polity, producing goods that were traded across the known world, maintaining a currency trusted from England to China, and doing all of this while simultaneously fighting off essentially every aggressive power in its neighborhood. The empire that wouldn't admit it had fallen was, for most of its existence, justified in its refusal. It was more Roman than the West that used the name more casually. It preserved what Rome had built, extended what Rome had created, and maintained for over 1,000 years a standard of civilization that the West would not match until well into the medieval period. It called itself Rome. It was Rome. And Rome, as it turned out, was very hard to kill. The court of ceremony, where ceremony was the point. The Book of Ceremonies, compiled in the 10th century by the Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos, who had the kind of name that suggests his parents had very specific expectations of him, is a document of approximately 800 pages describing in meticulous detail the correct procedure for court ceremonies in the Byzantine palace. Every ceremony. The correct order in which officials process, the specific words spoken at specific points, the precise silk robes worn by each rank of official on each type of occasion. What music plays when the emperor sits down? What music plays when the emperor stands up?
What happens if the emperor needs to leave the room? What happens if he returns? The correct way to receive foreign ambassadors. The correct way to receive foreign ambassadors who represent states the empire considers friendly versus states it considers hostile versus states it is currently technically at war with while also conducting diplomatic negotiations. 800 pages for ceremonies. This was not bureaucratic obsession for its own sake. The Byzantine court ceremony was a sophisticated political technology, and understanding why requires understanding what it was designed to do.
The ceremony created the empire, or more precisely, the ceremony made the empire visible, made its hierarchy tangible, made its claim to cosmic authority physically real in a way that mere assertion could not. When the emperor processed through the palace in his robes of Tyrian purple, a dye so expensive and labor-intensive that the right to wear it was restricted by law, with different shades indicating different ranks in the imperial hierarchy, and the court prostrated itself, and the particular music played, and the particular incense burned, what the ceremony was doing was making the claim of Roman imperial authority into a bodily, sensory, undeniable experience. Foreign ambassadors were subjected to this deliberately. The reception of ambassadors in the Byzantine palace was engineered to overwhelm.
The Liutprand of Cremona, a bishop from northern Italy who visited Constantinople in the 10th century and left behind one of the most entertainingly bitter travel accounts in medieval literature, described his reception in terms that suggest the engineering worked even on someone who deeply resented it. He was led through a series of increasingly grand halls. At each threshold, the level of ceremony increased. The music changed. The level of light changed. The quality of the silk on the walls changed.
By the time he reached the throne room, he was so thoroughly processed through layers of increasing magnificence that the mechanical throne that the emperor sat on, which could be raised by a hidden mechanism while the ambassador was performing his prostration, so that when the visitor looked up, the emperor appeared to have ascended to a greater height by supernatural means, landed with the full psychological force it was intended to have. The ambassador got up from his prostration to find the emperor sitting higher than he had been before.
The mechanical golden birds on the throne sang. The mechanical golden lions beside it roared. Liutprand wrote that he nearly had a heart attack. He was then deeply annoyed about this because he had come to negotiate from a position of dignity, and it was very difficult to feel dignified when mechanical lions were roaring at you. This was the point, entirely. Byzantine diplomatic strategy involved making everyone who came to the court you feel simultaneously awed and slightly destabilized. It is difficult to negotiate aggressively when you are still processing the singing birds. The palace complex itself, the Great Palace of Constantinople, which occupied a large portion of the peninsula's southeastern tip, was not a single building, but a city within the city. Dozens of buildings, halls, chapels, gardens, hippodrome-adjacent structures connected by colonnaded walkways and arranged over centuries of construction without any overriding plan. Officials who had worked there for years still got lost. This was, some historians have argued, also at least partially intentional.
A palace you cannot navigate is a palace that controls you. The court hierarchy within this labyrinth was of almost incomprehensible complexity, involving dozens of titles, ranks, and positions, many of which had become purely honorific over the centuries. A rank that had once involved actual military command had become a ceremonial title that courtiers bought from the emperor for a fixed fee, with the income going to the imperial treasury. The Byzantine court had essentially monetized its own titles.
You could pay to be a count, or a military commander, or a palace steward, and what you received in exchange was the right to wear certain colors of silk and stand in a specific position during certain ceremonies. The historian who described this system
noted with the kind of deadpan that becomes involuntary after spending enough time with Byzantine sources, that the Byzantines had essentially invented a subscription model for social status. Women occupied an unusual position in the Byzantine court. In theory, the empire was patriarchal, in the way that most medieval empires were.
In practice, the proximity of the imperial family to the sources of power and the Byzantine tradition of keeping imperial women within the palace complex rather than marrying them off to external noble families meant that empress mothers, empress wives, and empress sisters exercised genuine political authority with some regularity. The most dramatic example was Irene.
The Empress Irene, who served first as regent for her son Constantine VI, and then, when she felt his reign had gone on long enough, arranged for him to be blinded in the very room where he had been born, a detail that the Byzantine sources note with the matter-of-fact precision of people who had seen rather a lot of palace intrigue, and then ruled as sole empress from 797 to 802 CE, not as regent, not as empress consort, as emperor.
She used the male title, Basileus, emperor. She was the only woman in Byzantine history to claim the title in her own right, and she held it for 5 years. The West was so confused by this that Charlemagne's supporters used it as an argument for why Charlemagne should be crowned emperor by the Pope. If Constantinople was being run by a woman, they reasoned, perhaps the emperor of the Romans was currently vacant. The Byzantines found this argument absurd. The emperor of the Romans was sitting on her throne in Constantinople. She had signed the paperwork.
The music had played. The ceremony had been performed correctly. The birds had sung. The silk that the emperor wore was not merely expensive clothing. In the Byzantine symbolic system, it was a language. Each rank in the court hierarchy had specific colors and patterns of silk assigned to it, and wearing the wrong color or pattern was not a fashion faux pas. It was a legal offense. Purple was the imperial color, but there were gradations within purple, and gradations within the gradations. And the precise shade of purple worn by an emperor was different from the shade available to an empress, which was different from the shade available to the emperor's highest officials, which was different from the shade available to slightly less elevated officials, and so on down the hierarchy until you reached a level of courtier who was permitted to wear a particular shade of red and considered themselves quite elevated on that basis.
The dye that produced the true imperial purple, Tyrian purple, extracted from sea snails of the genus Murex, was so labor-intensive to produce that it genuinely was the most expensive material available in the medieval Mediterranean. Thousands of snails were required to produce a small amount of dye. The smell of the production process was, by ancient accounts, extraordinarily unpleasant. The end result, however, was a color of particular richness and intensity that could not be replicated by other means, which gave it a practical scarcity value on top of its symbolic significance.
The phrase born in the purple, porphyrogenitos, the word in the name of Constantine VII, referred specifically to children born to a reigning emperor in the purple chamber, a room in the palace decorated with purple porphyry stone. Such children had a specific legitimacy advantage in the complicated question of imperial succession. Constantine VII, as his name rather heavily implied, was indeed born in the purple, to a reigning emperor in the appropriate room.
This mattered to the Byzantines in ways that are difficult to fully convey. It was not merely a social fact, but a constitutional one. Evidence of divine favor expressed through the circumstances of birth. The religious dimension of Byzantine court ceremony cannot be separated from its
political dimension, because in Byzantine thought, these were not separate dimensions. The emperor's authority was divine in a specific sense, not in the sense that the emperor was himself divine. Byzantine theology was sophisticated enough to avoid that particular heresy, but in the sense that the emperor was the representative of God's order on earth, the one through whom divine providence expressed itself in political reality. The ceremony made this claim visible, made it real to the people participating in it, made it the shared experience of the court as a community.
The Hagia Sophia, holy wisdom, was the physical expression of this theology at its grandest scale. Built by Justinian in 537 CE, constructed in the extraordinarily short period of 5 years using a workforce estimated in the tens of thousands, designed by Isidore of Miletus and Anthemius of Tralles, with an engineering solution to the dome problem that their contemporaries considered miraculous, the Hagia Sophia was the largest enclosed space in the world for nearly 1,000 years. The dome, 45 meters above the floor, ringed with 40 windows that filled the space with light in a way that contemporary accounts describe as the dome appearing to float, suspended from heaven by a golden chain, was an engineering achievement of the first order, solved with a level of mathematical and practical sophistication that impressed everyone who saw it and baffled everyone who tried to copy it.
When the emperor entered the Hagia Sophia for the great liturgical celebrations, Christmas, Easter, the great feast days of the church calendar, the ceremony was not merely a religious service. It was a performance of the entire cosmic and political order. The emperor entered in procession. He was met at the great door by the Patriarch of Constantinople. The two great authorities of the Byzantine world, sacred and secular, acknowledged each other in a choreographed exchange whose every gesture was prescribed and significant.
Then they went inside, into the floating dome and the golden light, and the liturgy began. The choir of the Hagia Sophia was one of the great musical institutions of the ancient world. Byzantine liturgical music, the tradition of chant that had developed over centuries within the Eastern Church, with its specific modes and specific texts and specific performance practices, filled that dome in ways that were apparently overwhelming, even to hardened diplomats.
The Russian envoys of Prince Vladimir of Kiev, sent in the 980s to evaluate the major religions as potential state religions for Russia, reported back to Vladimir that when they were present at the Orthodox liturgy in the Hagia Sophia, they did not know whether they were in heaven or on earth. Vladimir chose orthodoxy for Russia. It is entirely possible that the architecture helped. The court feasts were themselves ceremonial occasions of considerable complexity. The imperial table, like the Persian king's table before it, was not a mere meal. It was a statement of hierarchy, abundance, and divine favor. The Kletterologion, a Byzantine administrative manual, described the precise seating arrangements for imperial banquets in detail as exacting as the Book of Ceremonies described the movement of officials through palace rooms. Who sat where? What food was served in what order? Who was permitted to recline and who must sit upright? What music played during which courses?
The food itself, at the highest levels of Byzantine court cuisine, was the product of a culinary tradition that had access to the spice routes of the Eastern Mediterranean and the agricultural products of the empire's remaining territories. Byzantine cooking combined Greek, Roman, and Near Eastern influences in ways that produced a cuisine of considerable sophistication. Honey, wine from the Aegean Islands, fish from the Black Sea.
The particular combination of ingredients that produced Byzantine gastronomy was not available anywhere else in the medieval world in quite the same way, because nowhere else had quite the same combination of economic reach, cultural synthesis, and institutional memory of classical Roman culinary tradition. The birds sang, the lions roared, the incense burned, the dome floated above it all. The ceremony was the empire, made visible and felt and experienced by everyone who participated in it. And it worked for longer than seems possible because the people who participated in it believed it. In the summer of 678 CE, an Arab fleet appeared in the waters outside Constantinople. The Arab armies had, in the preceding decades, swept through a significant portion of the Byzantine Empire's eastern territories with a speed and comprehensiveness that had left Constantinople considerably diminished in terms of its provincial tax base and considerably heightened in terms of its anxiety levels. Egypt was gone. Syria was gone. The rich agricultural lands of North Africa were in the process of going. The Arab armies and navies had proved themselves formidable in ways that the Byzantines had not entirely anticipated. The Arab fleet positioned itself to blockade and eventually assault Constantinople. It was a large fleet. It was well organized. Its commanders were competent. By any reasonable assessment of the military situation, Constantinople was in serious trouble. Then the Byzantine ships came out of the harbor, and from the prows of the Byzantine ships came something that nobody in the Arab fleet had seen before: a liquid projected through bronze tubes mounted on the ships. A liquid that caught fire when it hit the water. A liquid that could not be put out by water, that burned on the surface of the sea itself, that clung to wood and cloth and human beings, and that burned and burned and burned. Greek fire, the name given to it by the Western sources, though the Byzantines themselves called it various things: sea fire, liquid fire, the fire of the Romans. Whatever they called it, what it did was burn Arab ships while burning on the water that surrounded them, and the Arab fleet, confronted with fire that the sea itself would not extinguish, retreated. They came back the following year, and the year after that, and the year after that. 4 consecutive years of naval assault on Constantinople, and each time the Greek fire came out, and each time the Arab fleet retreated. This was the most significant military secret in the medieval world, and the Byzantines kept it with a thoroughness that historians still find remarkable. The formula was apparently known to only a very small number of people.
The Emperor Constantine VII, the same emperor who compiled the Book of Ceremonies, wrote instructions to his son that included an explicit warning. If foreign rulers asked about Greek fire, the emperor was to say that an angel had revealed the secret to Constantine the Great, that it was a divine gift to the empire, and that if anyone attempted to give the secret away or tried to obtain it by treachery, they would suffer the same fate as the biblical figure who had tried to buy the gifts of the Holy Spirit.
Which is a fairly dramatic way of saying absolutely not. We do not know with certainty what Greek fire was. This is one of the more extraordinary facts about a medieval military technology. After over 1,000 years of scholarly investigation, involving chemists, historians, weapons experts, and various interdisciplinary teams who have approached the problem from multiple directions, we do not have a definitive answer. The sources agree on the observable characteristics. It was liquid, it was projected, initially through heated bronze tubes, and later also launched in clay pots as a form of incendiary projectile.
It caught fire on contact with water, or at least was not extinguished by water. It burned with great intensity. It apparently generated a great deal of smoke and a sound that contemporary sources compare to thunder. It terrified everyone who encountered it for the first time, which in medieval warfare was worth almost as much as its actual destructive capability. The proposed ingredients, reconstructed from various partial accounts and technical analysis, include various combinations of petroleum distillates, quicklime, pine resin, sulfur, saltpeter, and other materials. The exact combination and the proportions remain unknown. Several researchers have produced working models that share some of the described characteristics.
None has produced something that matches all of them simultaneously.
The Byzantines kept the secret for roughly 3 centuries before it began to leak, through captured Byzantine technicians, through industrial espionage, through the inevitable entropy that affects any sufficiently long-lived secret. By the 10th and 11th centuries, versions of incendiary weapons were being used by other powers, but the original Byzantine formulation, the specific combination that burned on water so effectively, remains one of history's most durable, unsolved questions. Greek fire was not the only technology the Byzantines weaponized with unusual sophistication. Their diplomatic toolkit included several innovations that their contemporaries found difficult to counter. The principle of playing enemies against each other, funding one hostile tribe to fight another, maintaining a network of diplomatic marriages across the steppe peoples north of the Black Sea, making sure that any power that threatened Byzantium had a second threat appearing from another direction, was elevated by the Byzantines into something approaching a science.
The De Administrando Imperio, another text by Constantine VII, who had an unusual commitment to writing down things that probably should have been kept secret, is a diplomatic manual. It explains in considerable detail how to manage the various peoples on the Byzantine periphery, which tribes can be turned against which other tribes, what gifts to send to which rulers, how much gold the Pechenegs will require to attack the Bulgarians, how to ensure that the Rus remain commercially dependent enough on Byzantine trade to make outright military confrontation too costly to pursue.
It reads, in places, like a manual for a geopolitical board game. It is also one of the most useful primary sources historians have for understanding the political geography of the medieval world around Byzantium, which is an irony Constantine VII probably did not intend. The Varangian Guard, the elite military unit composed primarily of Norse warriors who had made their way to Constantinople via the river routes through Russia, was itself a kind of diplomatic technology.
By hiring the most dangerous military talent available from the northern periphery, the Byzantines simultaneously acquired formidable warriors and removed a potential threat. Norsemen who were employed, paid well, and stationed in the most magnificent city they had ever seen were Norsemen not raiding.
The empire's northern coast. The Guard became an institution of some prestige, and the position of guardsman was actively sought after by young men from Scandinavia and later from England, particularly after the Norman conquest of 1066, when a significant number of Anglo-Saxon warriors who found the new arrangement in England unsatisfactory made their way to Constantinople to offer their services. The Varangians who guarded the Byzantine emperor were in many cases the same people who had been raiding European monasteries a generation before.
Constantinople had converted them, not through preaching, but through gold, silk, and the overwhelming visual argument of the city itself, which was, in its own way, also a weapon. The military technology of the Byzantine Empire extended well beyond Greek fire into an entire system of defensive and offensive innovation that consistently surprised its enemies. The Byzantine approach to warfare was not the Roman approach, not the relentless offensive, the set-piece battle, the disciplined legionary advance. The Byzantine Empire, fighting for its survival on multiple frontiers simultaneously, with limited resources relative to its enemies, developed instead a military doctrine that emphasized intelligence, fortification, misdirection, and the avoidance of decisive engagement unless the terms were overwhelmingly favorable. The military manuals that Byzantine emperors and commanders produced form a remarkable body of military literature. The Strategicon, attributed to the Emperor Maurice in the late 6th century, is one of the most sophisticated military handbooks produced in the ancient or medieval world.
It covers not just tactics and weapons, but the psychology of different enemy peoples, their characteristic fighting methods, and the specific approaches best suited to defeating each of them.
The Pechenegs fight differently from the Bulgarians, who fight differently from the Arabs, who fight differently from the Lombards. The Byzantine commander who has read the Strategicon knows this and has been given advice specific to each situation. This kind of systematic, written, theoretically grounded approach to military problems was unusual in the early medieval world.
Most contemporary military traditions were transmitted through practice, through the master-to-student chain of experienced warriors teaching their methods to their successors. The Byzantine tradition was doing something closer to what we would call military science, attempting to identify general principles from historical examples and encode them in transmissible form. The application of this doctrine produced some remarkable military outcomes. Nicephorus II Phocas, one of the great generals of the Macedonian period, wrote his own military manual and then used its principles to reconquer Cilicia and parts of Syria from the Arab powers that had held them for centuries.
His campaigns were characterized by careful preparation, meticulous supply management, the use of raids and skirmishes to wear down the enemy before committing to major battle, and the construction of fortified positions that could serve as bases for further advance. He was methodical in a way that contrasted sharply with the more dramatic images of medieval warfare, and the method worked. The empire also invested heavily in fortification. The walls of Constantinople were the most famous example, but not the only one. Byzantine military engineering produced fortifications across the empire's territory, in Greece, in Anatolia, along the Danube frontier, that were designed with a sophisticated understanding of defensive geometry, sightlines, and the relationship between the fortification and the terrain it commanded. The hexamilion wall across the Isthmus of Corinth, built to defend the Peloponnese, was repeatedly rebuilt after being breached or demolished, each time incorporating improvements based on the lessons of its previous failure. The Byzantine navy was a formidable institution in the periods when the empire could afford to maintain it, and Greek fire was not its only technological advantage. The dromons, the primary warships of the Byzantine navy, were sophisticated vessels built and maintained to imperial specifications at the arsenal in Constantinople, crewed by professional sailors who served in what amounted to a permanent naval establishment. Byzantine naval tactics made specific use of Greek fire deployment, with the fire-projecting apparatus mounted on the largest ships in positions calculated to maximize the psychological effect as well as the physical damage. The Byzantine intelligence apparatus was, for its time, remarkable. The empire maintained what we might now call a diplomatic intelligence service, a network of informants, resident ambassadors, and paid contacts in the courts and contacts of its neighbors that provided the imperial court with information about threats, intentions, and opportunities at a level of sophistication that its contemporary competitors could not match. The De Administrando Imperio's frank discussion of how to play different neighboring peoples against each other presupposes exactly this kind of detailed intelligence about the relationships, grievances, and ambitions of the empire's neighbors. The use of religion as intelligence and diplomatic infrastructure was particularly characteristic. Byzantine missionaries were not merely spreading Christianity, they were extending the network of Byzantine influence and information gathering into territories that Byzantine armies could not reach. The conversion of Bulgaria, of Russia, of Serbia, was accomplished through missionary activity that the Byzantine court supported, encouraged, and monitored, partly for the genuine theological commitment that the Byzantines brought to their faith, and partly because a Christian Bulgaria that used Byzantine liturgical forms and looked to Constantinople for its ecclesiastical hierarchy was more predictable and manageable than a pagan Bulgaria that had no particular reason to care what Constantinople thought. The alphabet that Cyril and Methodius developed in the 9th century for the Slavic peoples, the Cyrillic alphabet, which is still used by Russian, Serbian, Bulgarian, and several other languages today, was created under Byzantine patronage as part of the missionary project. The ability to write down the liturgy in a language people actually spoke was a tool
for spreading Christianity. It was also a tool for spreading Byzantine cultural influence, Byzantine administrative methods, and Byzantine political frameworks into the Slavic world. The alphabet was a diplomatic instrument. Greek fire was the most dramatic Byzantine weapon, but the combination of military doctrine, fortification technology, naval capability, intelligence gathering, diplomatic innovation, and cultural projection was the more comprehensive and more lasting weapon. It kept an empire alive that had every reason to die against enemies that outnumbered it for longer than any reasonable assessment of the situation would have suggested was possible.
The secret of Greek fire is still unknown. The secret of Byzantine survival is somewhat more accessible. They were simply, in almost every domain that mattered, better at governing and defending a complex state than their opponents were. Not always, not everywhere, but consistently enough for long enough that the empire continued. The formula for Greek fire died with the empire. The formula for the other weapons survived in every state that inherited Byzantine administrative, legal, and diplomatic traditions, which is to say, most of the modern world.
The blinding of emperors and other career endings. Byzantine imperial succession did not follow a tidy hereditary rule. This is a diplomatic way of saying that the question of who would become emperor next was resolved with considerable frequency through means that would not be described as constitutional in any modern sense of the word. The theory was that the emperor was chosen by God, acclaimed by the army, the Senate, and the people, and that this divine mandate legitimized his rule.
The practice was that if you had sufficient military support, sufficient gold, and sufficient courage or desperation, you could declare yourself emperor and see what happened. If enough people agreed with you, if the army outside the city went to your side, if the faction in Constantinople that had been looking for a change decided your moment was their moment, then you were emperor. If they didn't, you were executed, or blinded, or mutilated, or sent to a monastery with your ears removed, depending on the preference of whoever had just defeated you.
The blinding. This requires a brief explanation because it is so central to Byzantine political history that historians have given it a specific term: political blinding. The theory behind it was essentially compassionate in a limited sense. Under Byzantine law, a man with a serious physical disability could not be emperor. This was not merely custom, it was constitutional. The emperor had to be physically whole to represent the empire properly. Therefore, if you blinded a rival, or cut off his nose, or removed his tongue, you had dealt with him politically without killing him. He could live.
He would just have to live without imperial ambitions. The practice was used extensively. Former emperors, potential claimants, rivals' sons, dangerous military commanders who had proven too successful for comfort. Blinding was employed as a political solution with a frequency that reflects the genuine ingenuity of Byzantine political problem-solving, even if the ingenuity was of a fairly dark variety. The most extraordinary application was Empress Irene's blinding of her own son, Constantine VI, whom she had decided was an insufficient emperor and an excessive obstacle to her own power. Constantine VI, for his part, had done himself no favors. He had divorced his first wife to marry someone else, which outraged a significant portion of the church and the court. He had lost several military campaigns. He had appointed relatives to positions they were not qualified for. He was, by most accounts, not a particularly effective emperor. His mother had him blinded in the Purple Chamber, the room in the palace where emperors were traditionally born, in 797. He died shortly afterward.
whether from the blinding itself or from subsequent neglect is unclear.
Irene then ruled as sole emperor for 5 years, until she was herself deposed by her finance minister in a bloodless palace coup. She was sent to a monastery, which was the Byzantine way of removing people from power in a manner that was technically merciful. She died the following year. The speed and frequency of Byzantine imperial turnover in certain periods is genuinely startling by the standards of any other medieval monarchy.
The period between 695 and 717 CE, roughly 20 years, saw no fewer than 6 emperors, most of whom ended their careers through violence or forced monasticism. The period produced a folk memory so vivid that later Byzantine historians referred to it simply as the time of troubles, a categorization that suggests even they found the pace of political change difficult to track. What prevented this instability from destroying the empire time after time was the extraordinary resilience of the administrative system.
The machinery of Byzantine government was staffed by trained professionals, civil servants in the most literal sense, who continued operating regardless of who was emperor. The taxes were collected, the army was supplied, the laws were applied, the diplomatic correspondence went out, a new emperor would arrive, the ceremonies would be performed to legitimate him, and the administrative apparatus would recognize the new authority and continue functioning. This is one of the great underrated achievements of the Byzantine state. Most pre-modern governments were highly dependent on the personal relationships and abilities of the ruler. Byzantine government had professionalized to a degree where the system could survive bad emperors, short-reigning emperors, child emperors, regent-run emperors, and the occasional 6 emperor in 20 years period, without the essential functions of the state ceasing to operate. The Macedonian dynasty, which ruled from 867 to 1056, represented the empire's second great flowering, the period when Byzantine cultural achievement, diplomatic reach, and military power reached its medieval peak. The emperors Nikephoros II Phocas, John I Zimiscus, and Basil II, called Bulgaroktonos, the Bulgar Slayer, for reasons that will shortly become clear, pushed the empire's frontiers back outward, reconquering territories lost to the Arabs, reasserting dominance over the Balkans, and reaching a level of administrative and military capability that had not been seen since Justinian.
Basil II deserves particular attention because he was both one of the most effective Byzantine emperors and one of the most ruthlessly methodical. He spent much of his reign campaigning against the Bulgarian Empire, which had expanded significantly into the Balkans at Byzantine expense over the preceding century. In 1014, at the Battle of Cleidion, he captured approximately 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers. He blinded them. Not all of them. He blinded 99 men in every 100, leaving the 100th man with one eye so he could lead the other 99 home. The Bulgarian Tsar Samuel, according to the sources, saw his blinded army returning and died of shock 2 days later. Whether this is precisely accurate as a medical description is uncertain. That something devastating happened when Samuel saw 15,000 blinded men walking toward him is entirely believable. It is a story that stops you, that makes you put down whatever you are reading and simply sit with it for a moment.
Not because it is the most violent thing in medieval history. It is not, by some distance, but because of the specific, calculated nature of it. The decision to leave one man in 100 with one eye. The engineering of the horror as a message. The Bulgarian Empire collapsed within a few years. The message had been received. Basil II is still regarded as one of the greatest Byzantine emperors. History, as it frequently does, contains multitudes.
The question of what made someone a legitimate Byzantine emperor was never fully resolved, And this unresolvedness was both a weakness and, in a strange way, a strength of the system. It was a weakness because it meant that anyone with sufficient military support and sufficient
Audacity could make a credible claim to the throne, creating permanent instability at the highest level of government. It was a strength because it meant that the system was self-correcting in a brutal way. An emperor who had lost the confidence of the military, the church, and the capital's population would not stay emperor long. The mechanism for removing him was violent, but it existed and it functioned, which is more than can be said for systems that produced bad monarchs with no mechanism for removal at all. The church's role in imperial legitimacy was complicated and evolved over the centuries. The Patriarch of Constantinople, the head of the Eastern Church, second only to the emperor in Byzantine ceremonial precedents, had the role of crowning emperors, which gave the church a formal constitutional role in legitimating whoever was claiming the throne. But the patriarchs were themselves appointed by the emperors, which meant that whoever had the throne also controlled who wore the patriarchal vestments, which rather undermined the independence of the ecclesiastical check on imperial power.
The iconoclast controversy, the great theological and political crisis of the 8th and early 9th centuries, in which the Byzantine Empire was convulsed by the question of whether the veneration of icons was legitimate Christian practice or idolatry, reveals the complexity of this relationship at its most extreme. The Emperor Leo III, in 726, ordered the removal of a prominent icon of Christ from above the chalky gate of the palace.
This act unleashed a controversy that divided Byzantine society, produced martyrs on both sides, saw emperors depose patriarchs and patriarchs denounce emperors, and created a political and theological crisis that lasted over a century. The resolution of the iconoclast controversy, the final restoration of icons in 843, an event still celebrated in the Orthodox Church as the triumph of orthodoxy, was partly theological and partly political.
The iconoclast emperors had associated icon veneration with women, monks, and what they considered an excess of superstition. The iconophile position became associated with the defense of tradition, of the accumulated religious culture of the empire, of the holy images that the faithful had venerated for centuries. When the iconoclasts lost, they lost on both levels simultaneously, theologically discredited and politically defeated. What the iconoclast controversy demonstrates about Byzantine political culture is the degree to which religious questions were simultaneously political questions, in a way that has no exact modern equivalent.
The Byzantines did not separate church and state, not because they hadn't thought about the relationship, but because in the Byzantine understanding, church and state were different aspects of a single divinely ordered reality. The emperor was not the head of the church, that was the patriarch, but the emperor was the guardian of the church, responsible for its correct operation and the maintenance of orthodoxy. Religious error was therefore a political concern, and political conflict regularly expressed itself through religious controversy. The military emperors of the Macedonian dynasty, Nicephorus Phocas, John Zimisces, Basil II, operated in a context where this relationship had stabilized somewhat, where the major theological controversies had been resolved, and where the empire's energies could be directed more cleanly outward. Basil II's career illustrates the possibilities and the costs of this focused outward direction particularly well. Basil II came to the throne in 976 as nominal co-emperor with his brother, both of them under the effective rule of powerful military commanders. It took him years to assert genuine personal control, during which he survived 2 serious military revolts led by generals who thought they could replace him. The defeat of these revolts and the severity of his response to the rebel leaders and their families established a pattern that characterized his reign: methodical, patient,
entirely without mercy when he finally moved. His Bulgarian campaigns occupied most of his active reign.
The Bulgarian Empire, under Tsar Samuel, had expanded significantly at Byzantine expense during the years of weakness and internal conflict that preceded Basil's consolidation of power. The reconquest was not a single dramatic campaign, but a series of annual expeditions over decades, methodically reducing Bulgarian territory, taking fortresses, establishing Byzantine control over the Balkans, inch by inch. The Battle of Kleidion and its aftermath were the culmination of this patient campaign. Basil caught a large Bulgarian army in a mountain pass, surrounded it, and achieved a victory that left him with approximately 15,000 prisoners.
The blinding was the decision of a man who had been fighting this war for 20 years and understood exactly what message needed to be sent, and to whom, and at what scale. It was not impulsive. It was calculated with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized everything Basil did. Basil II died in 1025 while preparing a campaign to reconquer Sicily. He left behind an empire at its greatest extent since Justinian, a full treasury, and no designated heir, because he had spent his life campaigning rather than administering the court politics that succession required.
The dynasty outlasted him by 3 decades, but the successors who followed him lacked his particular combination of patience, determination, and ruthlessness, and the empire they inherited began slowly to contract. The system of political blinding that had been used to remove Basil himself from childhood. He had spent his early years as nominal emperor while military commanders held real power, a situation he remembered and resolved never to replicate, continued to be used throughout the later empire. It was not unique to the Byzantines. Other medieval states used mutilation as a form of political disqualification. But the Byzantines systematized it in a way that made it a standard tool of succession management, applied with the same institutional consistency as everything else in the Byzantine administrative system. The emperors who came and went, and in some periods they came and went with considerable speed, were individuals. The empire endured because it was not dependent on any of them personally. This is the paradox at the heart of Byzantine political history. The most personal of systems, the single ruler chosen by God, sustained itself through the most impersonal of mechanisms, the professional administration that continued regardless of who the ruler was. Individuals are mortal and fallible. The institution was neither, at least not for a very long time.
In 1054, representatives of the Pope of Rome and the Patriarch of Constantinople walked into the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral of Constantinople, the largest church in the world at the time, and placed a document of excommunication on the altar. They then walked out. The Great Schism, the formal split between the Roman Catholic Church of the West and the Eastern Orthodox Church of the Byzantine world. It had been building for centuries, through disputes about theology, about church authority, about who had the right to appoint bishops, about whether the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father or from the Father and the Son, which is a theological distinction that seems, from the outside, to be the kind of thing reasonable people might agree to disagree about, but which had in fact been generating increasingly heated correspondence for 200 years before finally reaching the altar document stage. The split mattered politically in ways that went beyond theology. It meant that Byzantine Christianity and Western Christianity were now officially 2 different things. It meant that the Pope and the Emperor in Constantinople had competing claims to spiritual and political authority in the overlapping territories between East and West. It meant that when, in 1095, Pope Urban II called for a crusade to recapture Jerusalem from the Seljuk Turks,
the relationship between the Crusader armies and the Byzantine Empire was already complicated by a religious divide that gave both sides reasons to regard the other with suspicion. The First Crusade, from the Byzantine perspective, was a mixed experience.
The Crusaders did successfully take Jerusalem in 1099, which was theoretically good news for the empire. They also established their
Own principalities in the recovered territories rather than handing them back to Byzantine control, which was considerably less good news. And they passed through Byzantine territory in a way that required the Emperor Alexios I Komnenos to engage in some extremely careful diplomatic management to prevent the passing armies from deciding that Constantinople was a more attractive target than Jerusalem.
Alexios I was, by all accounts, one of the more capable Byzantine emperors, a judgment formed partly by the fact that his daughter Anna Komnene wrote a biography of him that is one of the great primary sources of Byzantine history, and daughters writing their father's biographies tend, on balance, toward a favorable portrayal. But even accounting for filial partiality, the diplomatic achievement of successfully redirecting 4 separate Crusader armies through Byzantine territory without significant incident was not nothing. The Second and Third Crusades passed through the region with varying degrees of diplomatic friction.
By the Fourth Crusade, the friction had become something considerably worse. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, was supposed to go to Egypt. It did not go to Egypt. It went to Constantinople. The story of how the Fourth Crusade ended up sacking the city it was ostensibly allied with involves a Venetian trade dispute, a complicated Byzantine succession crisis, a young Byzantine prince who promised the Crusaders more than he could deliver, and the fundamental reality that Constantinople was fabulously, incomprehensibly wealthy, and the Crusader armies were broke.
The specific details of how these factors combined to produce the sack of Constantinople in 1204 are the subject of considerable historical debate. What isn't debated is what happened. The Crusaders went over the walls of Constantinople in April 1204, and then they sacked it. 3 days of looting, churches, palaces, the Hagia Sophia itself, stripped of centuries of accumulated treasure, the bronze horses from the Hippodrome, ancient Greek sculptures of extraordinary quality, taken to Venice, where they still stand today above the entrance to St. Mark's Basilica.
Relics, manuscripts, gold, silver, silk, ivory, taken, destroyed, or lost in the chaos of an army that had given up pretending it was on a religious mission and was simply taking everything it could carry. The Byzantine aristocracy fled. A rump empire was established at Nicaea in Asia Minor. The Crusaders set up a Latin empire in Constantinople, which proved to be a depressing, impoverished, and chaotic thing that lasted 57 years before the Byzantines took the city back in 1261. The damage was not primarily physical. Constantinople was damaged, yes, but cities can be rebuilt.
The damage was to the accumulated material culture of 1,000 years. The manuscripts that burned, the artworks that were melted down for the metal, the objects that were taken to Venice or France or Germany and are now in museums far from
Where they were made, the loss was real and irreversible. The Byzantine Empire that returned to Constantinople in 1261 was a smaller, poorer, more precarious thing than the empire that had been taken from it. The territories had fragmented during the Latin occupation. The economic networks had been disrupted. The relationship with the West, always complicated, was now poisoned in ways that made the kind of mutual assistance against common threats that the empire needed functionally impossible. The Ottomans had been expanding in Anatolia while all of this was happening. They were still expanding.
And Constantinople diminished
its walls still standing but its resources depleted, its empire reduced to the city and a few territories, watched them come closer. The Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last emperor, reportedly told his counselors in the final days before the Ottoman assault that he wished to die defending the city rather than surrender it. He is not known to have changed his mind.
The relationship between Constantinople and Rome, between the Byzantine Church and the Papal Church, had been deteriorating for centuries before the formal schism of 1054, accumulating grievances like sediment in a slow river, each deposit small and apparently manageable, the total building to something much harder to move.
The theological disagreement about the filioque, the Latin word for "and the Son," added to the Nicene Creed by Western churches to indicate that the Holy Spirit proceeds from both the Father and the Son, rather than from the Father alone, as the Eastern tradition maintained, was genuinely important as a theological matter to people for whom theology was the most serious intellectual and spiritual concern of their lives. It was not a frivolous dispute.
It touched on fundamental questions about the nature of the Trinity, about the relationship between the different persons of the divine, about the correct understanding of the faith. These were not small questions. But the theological dispute was also inseparable from the political dispute about authority. The Pope claimed a universal primacy, a right to final authority over the entire Christian church in both doctrine and discipline, that the Patriarch of Constantinople rejected.
The Byzantine Church acknowledged a primacy of honor to Rome as the ancient capital of the empire and the church founded by Peter and Paul. It did not acknowledge a primacy of jurisdiction. The difference between honor and jurisdiction is the difference between saying someone is first among equals and saying they are the superior of the others. And it was exactly the difference that both sides agreed was non-negotiable. The cultural divergence ran deeper than theology and ecclesiology. The Western Church had operated in Latin for centuries, the Eastern Church in Greek.
The theological vocabulary that each tradition had developed reflected the grammatical and philosophical structures of its language in ways
That made translation not merely difficult, but potentially misleading. A Greek theological concept rendered in Latin might change its meaning in ways that created new controversies, rather than resolving existing ones. The Byzantines, who regarded themselves as the custodians of classical Greek culture, and genuinely were more directly connected to that heritage than any other medieval civilization, sometimes regarded the Latin West with a cultural condescension that the Western representatives found insufferable. The Latins regarded Byzantine theological refinement as sophistry, and Byzantine claims to imperial superiority as delusional, given the political reality of the 11th century.
Liutprand of Cremona's accounts of his visits to Constantinople, particularly his second visit in 968 as ambassador of the Emperor Otto I, are among the most revealing documents in Byzantine history, not for their accuracy, which is questionable, but for what they reveal about how the cultural and political tensions of the period were experienced personally. Liutprand hated almost everything about Constantinople, with the specificity and personal intensity of someone who had expected to be treated with more respect than he received. He hated the wine, which he described as mixed with pitch and resin. He hated the fish, which he found overwhelmingly present. He hated the silk he was given as a diplomatic gift, which he described as of inferior quality, and was then furious when Byzantine customs officials confiscated it at the border on the grounds that silk of that quality was under export control. He found the Emperor Nikephoros II personally unappealing, describing his complexion, his beard, and his eyes in terms that would have constituted a legal complaint in most jurisdictions. And yet, Liutprand's accounts are full of grudging acknowledgments of Byzantine achievement, the mechanical throne, the singing birds.
The quality of the ceremony, which he simultaneously resented and could not deny, was impressive. The size of the city, which was simply beyond anything in his experience. He hated Constantinople with the particular intensity of someone who has been made to feel inadequate by it.
The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204 crystallized in 3 days of violence, a relationship that had been deteriorating for 2 centuries. The Crusaders who went over the walls were not purely by greed, though greed was certainly a component. They were also acting out, in military form, a relationship of accumulated resentment, theological disagreement, cultural contempt running in both directions, and political rivalry that had built up since the Schism and beyond. The Eastern Christians whose city they sacked were not, in the minds of most Crusader soldiers, fully Christian in the relevant sense.
They were schismatics. They used different liturgical forms. They refused to acknowledge the Pope. They had been unhelpful to previous crusades in ways that the Crusader narrative blamed on Byzantine perfidy rather than on Byzantine interests. The Byzantine understanding of what happened in 1204 was shaped by the same logic in reverse. The Crusaders who came through the walls were not fellow Christians who had gone somewhat off course.
They were Western barbarians who had always been looking for an opportunity, who would use the religious cover of crusading to do what they had wanted to do since they first started passing through Byzantine territory. The sack confirmed what many Byzantines had long suspected about the Western attitude toward their empire. The wounds of 1204 did not heal in the 2.5 centuries that remained to the empire.
When the Ottomans were closing in on Constantinople in the final decades, some voices in the city argued for union with Rome, for accepting papal primacy in exchange for Western military assistance. The Council of Florence in 1439 produced a document of union, signed by the Byzantine emperor and accepted with varying degrees of sincerity by various Byzantine church officials. The Western military assistance it was supposed to generate did not materialize in useful quantities.
The population of Constantinople, when they heard about the Florentine Union, reportedly responded with a phrase that has been quoted ever since: "Better the Sultan's turban than the Cardinal's hat." Whether this was literally said, or is a later crystallization of a genuine sentiment, it captures something real about the Byzantine relationship with Western Christianity by the final decades. The wounds were too deep, the trust too exhausted. The schism of 1054 had, after 1204, become something much more than a theological disagreement.
The Crusaders who came to help the Holy Land ended by destroying the city they were supposed to be allied with. The logic of the situation, debt, greed, political manipulation, accumulated resentment, proved stronger than the shared religious identity that was supposed to make such an outcome unthinkable. The marble and gold of Constantinople entered Venice, where it still is. The spiritual and cultural inheritance of Byzantium went elsewhere, went east into the Russian church, went
West, carried by scholars on boats, went into the Ottoman Empire, which found much of Byzantine administrative practice useful and incorporated it into Ottoman government. The empire ended. The inheritance dispersed. And the sum of what was dispersed was, in total, rather larger than the empire itself had been. The fall and everything that didn't fall with it. On May 29th, 1453, at approximately first light, the Ottoman army broke through the walls of Constantinople. It was not a sudden collapse. The walls had held for 53 days of siege.
Mehmed II, 21 years old, ambitious beyond anything his court had fully anticipated, and in possession of the largest cannons in the world at that time, had been bombarding the walls since April. The Theodosian walls, which had held for 1,000 years, were not immune to cannon fire.
They were damaged, repaired, damaged again. The defenders, outnumbered by a ratio that historians estimate at somewhere between 5-1 and 15-1, depending on how you count the Ottoman forces, repaired the walls by night and defended them by day.
The final breach came through a small gate that had been left unlocked, or left inadequately defended in the complexity of a night engagement with multiple breach attempts happening simultaneously. The Ottoman troops poured through. The Emperor Constantine XI, who had been informed by his counselors that escape was still possible, who had been offered safe passage by Mehmed himself if he would simply surrender the city, removed his imperial regalia and walked into the battle without it. His body was never definitively identified. Some accounts say he died fighting beside the wall.
Some say he was found among the common soldiers, identified only by his distinctive purple-soled boots. Some say he wasn't found at all. The Greeks developed a legend, which persists to this day, that he did not die, that an angel turned him to marble and placed him in a cave beneath the city, waiting to wake when Constantinople is restored to Greek hands. He has been waiting, in the legend, for 570 years. Mehmed II entered the city on horseback in the early afternoon.
He went to the Hagia Sophia, which had been the great cathedral of Eastern Christianity for nearly 1,000 years, and performed the Friday prayers there. He is reported to have looked around at the fallen plaster, at the looted gold fittings, at the building itself, and quoted a Persian couplet about spiders weaving their curtains in the palace of the Caesars and owls calling the watches in the towers of Afrasiab. He was 21 years old, standing in the building that symbolized everything he had just conquered, and what he felt, apparently, was the weight of it. Not triumph, something more complex, something like the melancholy that comes from achieving.
The thing you have spent your whole life pursuing, and discovering that the achieving of it does not fill the space you thought it would. Or perhaps he simply liked Persian poetry. He was that kind of young man. What fell in 1453 was the political structure of the empire. What did not fall with it was considerably more than most people realize. The scholars. In the decades before the final fall, and in the immediate aftermath, Byzantine scholars carrying manuscripts made their way west.
They went to Venice, to Florence, to Rome, to the courts of Italian humanist patrons who understood what they were being offered. These scholars brought with them Greek language expertise, access to ancient texts, and an intellectual tradition that had never entirely severed its connection to the classical Greek world in the way that the Latin West had. The Italian Renaissance, that extraordinary flowering of art, literature, philosophy, and science that remade European civilization from the 15th century onward, was not caused by the fall of Constantinople. It had its own causes, its own internal dynamics.
But the arrival of Byzantine scholars with Greek texts, teaching Greek to Italian humanists, providing direct access to Plato and Aristotle in the original rather than in Latin translation, this accelerated the Renaissance in ways that historians have been documenting for a century. The legal tradition, Justinian's codification of Roman law, preserved and developed by the Byzantines for 1,000 years, had already been flowing westward through the medieval period. But the final transmission of Byzantine legal scholarship reinforced and extended a tradition that became the foundation of European civil law.
Most of continental Europe today operates on legal systems derived from Roman law, as preserved and transmitted through the Byzantine tradition, the Orthodox Christian tradition. The Byzantine Church did not die with the empire. It spread through Byzantine missionary activity in the preceding centuries into Russia, into Serbia, into Bulgaria, into Romania, into Georgia and Armenia. The Russian Orthodox Church, the Serbian Orthodox Church, the Romanian and Bulgarian churches
all daughters of the Byzantine ecclesiastical tradition, maintaining the theology, the liturgy, the iconographic tradition, and many of the cultural practices of an empire that no longer politically existed.
Russia, in particular, understood itself as the heir to Byzantium. After the fall of Constantinople, the idea of Moscow as the Third Rome, the continuation of Constantinople's sacred inheritance, developed in Russian political thought and became a significant part of Russian imperial identity. The double-headed eagle of the Byzantine Empire, which signified the empire's dominion over both East and West, became the symbol of the Russian czars. The word czar itself, the title of Russian emperors, is derived from Caesar. Through Byzantium, the title of Roman emperor became the title of Russian emperors.
The line of inheritance.
From ancient Rome to modern geopolitics runs, improbably but actually, through a city on a peninsula in Turkey that insisted it was Rome for 1,100 years. The Hagia Sophia itself still stands, built by Justinian in the 6th century, converted to a mosque after 1453, converted to a museum in 1934, converted back to a mosque in 2020. The same building, the same walls that have heard, across 15 centuries, Christian liturgy, Ottoman prayer, tourist commentary, and now prayer again.
The mosaics that the Ottomans plastered over rather than destroying, which Turkish restorers and later secular museum management gradually revealed, and which are now partially covered and partially revealed in a building that has been, for 1,500 years, the most contested piece of sacred architecture on earth. The last emperor rode into battle without his regalia. The scholars got on the boats with their manuscripts. The Hagia Sophia stayed where it was, as it always had, doing what it had always done, being the most important building in whatever city surrounded it.
The empire that wouldn't admit it had fallen finally fell. And it left behind, scattered across the world in law codes and church traditions and manuscripts and the names of stars and the word Tsar and the legal foundations of half the countries on earth, and a mosque that used to be a cathedral, that used to be the greatest church in Christendom. It left behind more than most empires that lasted a fraction of its time. The Marble Emperor is still waiting, in the legend, waiting for the owls and the spiders to clear out. Sleep well.
Rome is still out there, somewhere. It always has been. The fall of Constantinople did not arrive without warning. It had been arriving for 2 centuries, announced by the shrinking of the empire's territory, the depletion of its treasury, the deterioration of its military capability, and the rising power of the Ottoman state to its east. Constantine XI, the last emperor, understood this. His court understood this. The population of Constantinople understood this. What they disagreed about in the final years and months was what to do about it.
The practical options were limited. Appeal to the West for military assistance, which required swallowing the theological humiliation of the Florentine Union, and which had, in any case, produced the Crusade of Varna in 1444, which ended in disaster at Varna before it reached Constantinople.
Try to negotiate with Mehmed II, which Mehmed made clear was not a genuine option, that Constantinople was the prize he wanted, and the price he was offering was the emperor's life and safe passage for the population, which was not nothing, but was not an acceptable political settlement to anyone who cared about the empire's continuation, or simply defend the walls and hope. Constantine XI chose the walls. The Ottoman siege was technically sophisticated in ways that reflected the military culture Mehmed II had assembled.
The cannon, Urban's cannons, built by a Hungarian engineer who had first offered his services to Constantine and been turned down, one presumes partly on grounds of expense, and who had then accepted Mehmed's offer
were the largest field artillery pieces that had been produced up to that point. The Theodosian walls, which had held against everything short of the Fourth Crusade's betrayal, were not designed for an era of heavy artillery. They could be repaired, but they could not be made resistant to sustained bombardment by weapons of a scale that their builders had not imagined. The defenders numbered perhaps 7,000, of whom a significant proportion were foreign volunteers, Genoese soldiers under Giovanni Giustiniani, Venetian sailors whose ships happened to be in harbor when the siege began, Catalans, Turks who served in the Byzantine army for various complicated reasons of their own, against an Ottoman force estimated at 60,000 to 80,000. The ratio was not favorable. What is remarkable is how long they held.
53 days of siege, of daily bombardment, of nightly repair of the walls, of sorties to disrupt Ottoman operations, of the final desperate defense of the breached sections. The defenders had one significant early success. They blocked the Ottoman Navy's access to the Golden Horn with a great chain across the entrance, and Mehmet was forced to respond by dragging his ships overland on greased rails to bypass the chain and enter the inlet from the landward side. It worked.
The image of Ottoman ships moving overland while the defenders watched from the walls remains one of the more dramatic moments of the siege. The final assault came on the night of May 28th to 29th. Multiple simultaneous attacks on different sections of the walls. The section near the Kerkaporta gate, a small postern door, was either left unlocked or broken open early in the assault, and Ottoman troops poured through before the breach could be contained. The Genoese commander, Giustiniani, was wounded in the fighting, seriously enough that
he was carried to his ship and removed from the city, a departure that some Byzantine sources blamed for undermining the defense at the crucial moment, though his wound was apparently severe enough that remaining was not a practical option. Constantine XI fought in the final chaos at the breach. He died there. The accounts agree on this, even when they disagree on the details. He removed his imperial regalia so he would not be identified, either to avoid being taken prisoner, or in some accounts, so he could fight without the constraint of being a prize. His body was found afterward only by the purple boots, or possibly was never definitively found at all, depending on which source you follow. Mehmed II entered the city early in the afternoon. He went to the Hagia Sophia first. He is described by the sources as moved by the building in ways that went beyond the satisfaction of conquest, genuinely awed by the structure, by its scale, by the beauty of the mosaics, by the accumulated artistic and religious significance that filled the space. He converted it to a mosque. He also ordered the cessation of looting, which the Ottoman army had been engaged in since the city fell. His order is described as effective, which says something about his control of his army and about the Byzantine accounts that followed, though it is worth noting that the Byzantine historians had reason to portray the final Ottoman takeover as more orderly than the 1204 Crusader sack, because the contrast served their own rhetorical purposes. The population was not massacred. Some were enslaved, per the customs of medieval conquest. Most were permitted to remain. The Patriarch of Constantinople was allowed to continue in office under Ottoman sovereignty. The Orthodox Church, under Ottoman rule, maintained its institutional existence and its hierarchy, now within the millet system that organized the Ottoman Empire's non-Muslim communities. Greek Orthodox Christianity survived the fall of the empire that had nurtured it, and in some respects, carried it through the Ottoman centuries in better institutional health than it had managed in the last decades of the empire, when factional conflict, poverty, and despair had weakened the church along with everything else. The scholars who had been leaving for the West in the years before the fall, and who accelerated their departure in the immediate aftermath, brought with them not just texts, but expertise. They could read ancient Greek in its full complexity. They could explain the philosophical vocabulary of Plato and Aristotle
in ways that Latin translations could not fully capture. They brought a living tradition of Greek learning into contact with the Italian humanist movement that was already developing an interest in classical culture. And the combination was explosive, in the best sense.
The recovery of the Greek philosophical heritage
By the Western Renaissance, the reading of Plato in the original, the development of Neoplatonism as a philosophical movement, the general engagement with ancient thought that characterized the Renaissance at its best, owed an enormous debt to Byzantine intermediaries who made it possible. The Hagia Sophia is still there. The walls of Constantinople, Istanbul now, are still partially standing, a remarkable survival through 1,500 years of earthquakes, wars, and urban development. The legal systems of most of continental Europe descend from Justinian's codification, transmitted and developed through the Byzantine legal tradition.
The Orthodox churches of Russia, Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, and several other countries maintain theological and liturgical traditions rooted in Byzantine Christianity. The Cyrillic alphabet, used by hundreds of millions of people, was created under Byzantine patronage for the Slavic missions. The Byzantine Empire lasted from 330 CE, when Constantine founded Constantinople, to 1453, when Constantine XI died in the walls. 1,123 years, more or less, depending on how you count the beginning. An empire that called itself Rome for its entire existence.
that maintained Roman law, Roman administrative tradition, and Roman civic culture through 11 centuries of external pressure, internal crisis, and the gradual shrinkage of everything except the idea. The last emperor removed his purple boots. The mechanical birds have not sung for 570 years. The golden horn is still there, still blue in the afternoon light, still where it has always been. And the marble emperor is still in his cave, according to the legend, still waiting, still Rome, still refusing, even now, to admit that it has fallen. Sleep well.